Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring today's most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol announced the lifting of emergency martial law early Wednesday, just 6 hours after he declared the order. Yoon declared emergency martial law late Tuesday night, accusing the nation's opposition of paralyzing the government with anti-state activities. Following this, the National Assembly swiftly passed a resolution demanding its repeal. By early Wednesday, all 190 lawmakers present voted in favor of lifting the order, including members of Yoon's very own Conservative People Power Party. Troops were withdrawn and the emergency measures were lifted just 6 hours after being declared. Now, this marks the first time in 45 years that martial law has been imposed in South Korea. For a closer look on this, we invite Song Se-ryun, professor of law at Kyunghee University. Welcome to the program, Professor Song.
Hello, thank you.
And also joining us is Professor Lee Hee-eun, Dean and Professor of Law at Handong International Law School. Great to have you, Professor Lee.
Thanks for having me.
Now, let's begin with Professor Song. So it was a very surprising move for citizens to witness on Tuesday night. Before we get into the details, it's been more than 4 decades, like I said, since we've seen this happen. Could you tell us what martial law is and what this entails?
Well, martial law is a legal framework that allows a government to temporarily replace civilian governance and law enforcement with a military authority to deal with extreme emergencies that threatens order, security, or sovereignty. So we're talking about in times of war, armed conflict, or similar national emergencies. So obviously the purpose is to restore order and address crises that threatens those state of being. So what we were baffled yesterday was that we didn't see any war, armed conflict, or any kind of national emergencies, other than the fact that the president is having trouble with the legislature because of the low approval rates and also the supermajority that the opposition has in the National Assembly. Certainly, that didn't seem like a national emergency.
Right, and though the martial law order has been lifted, many would wonder then what specific changes could have occurred in our daily lives. Could you give us a picture of the situation, Professor Lee?
Well, I mean, completely the changed landscape would be complete in the sense that, as Professor Song was mentioning, you would have military rule temporarily, and the idea would be, with respect to judicial as well as administrative functions, that will be controlled by the military. So with respect to this context, then, if you have martial law, then basic civil liberties will be suspended. And so that's the sense that your rights with respect to, let's say, arrest, with respect to searches and seizures, those kinds of things will be taken then by the military and not be subject to judicial review that you would have sort of in the normal context in a normal situation without military authorities sort of in control. So the main issue here is, of course, civil liberties, because the military will then take control. And not only in terms of that question about enforcement, but also with respect to crimes that may be committed. So normally, if you commit a crime, you go to a civilian court. But in this case, with martial law, the military courts would take over in certain kinds of situations. And under sort of the law of the land, with respect to martial law, there's a whole list of crimes that now would be covered and now be charged and sort of prosecuted within the military courts. So just in a nutshell, then, if martial law had been imposed and maintained, right, we would see a completely different landscape when it came to judicial and administrative functions.
Right, and considering that it was a very abrupt announcement that even the president's ruling party lawmakers, some of them weren't aware of, many claim Yoon's announcement goes against the Constitution. Professor, what are the requirements and the procedures under the Constitution for one to declare martial law?
So this falls under Article 77 of the Constitution. And in this case, as Professor Song mentioned earlier, there has to be a certain kind of national emergency, right? We're talking about something that would be akin to war, a disaster of some kind, right, where there would be some kind of chaos, right, within the public. And so in this context, if such a situation occurred, then in this case, the president has the authority to declare martial law. Now, the internal procedure for that to happen is there's a couple of ways that could happen. In one sense is the Minister of Defense or the Minister of Interior and Safety can propose and suggest to the president that maybe martial law should be declared. And there needs to be some deliberation by the state council before the president can actually make that decision to announce a martial law. So this cannot be a unilateral decision on the part of the president, because it has to be done within the context of his cabinet and also with respect to the Minister of Defense or the Minister of Interior and Safety. But with respect to then, if that's declared, then you have to then, in this context, also then abide by the Martial Law Act. There's a statute in Korea that governs martial law, and so in the context of this situation, it also identifies, in what context this can be done. And I think deliberation within the president's cabinet is a big deal, because the question there, of course, and has been reported with respect to what happened within the state council, then to sort of make the recommendation or not to then declare martial law, or if the president indeed made this decision unilaterally on his own. So those are some questions that I think will be fleshed out in the days and weeks to come.
Right, so there needs to be consent from the cabinet as well. Now to the key question, Professor Song. Many people have been eager to know what exactly is the primary reason behind President Yoon's declaration of martial law. How do you read into the situation?
Well, I joined those people who were thinking, what was that all about? I'm myself baffled by the poorly executed martial law's announcement. There are theories. I think he might have honestly thought that what opposition party was doing, impeaching cabinet members, reducing national debt, national budgets, threatening special prosecutor investigations and whatnot, he might have thought that was truly detrimental to national security. But that would be ill-advised, the advice situation. I think that what is more important and more concerning is that nobody in his cabinet has spoken out and said, well, what you're trying to do is quite illegal or ill-advised. And nobody stopped them. It seems like his own judgment, his own decision-making apparatus are all in question. And it seems to be another evidence that this neophyte president doesn't quite know what president should do and should not do. So I think going forward, I think those questions need to be answered before it gets back to true normalcy.
Right, and now bipartisan lawmakers were swift to gather at the Parliament after the declaration, and they passed a resolution requesting the lifting of the martial law. What is the legal effect of the National Assembly's demand to lift martial law, and could the vote be considered as the final say, Professor Song?
Yes, the Constitution Article 77, as Professor Lee mentioned, does state this issue. It says when the National Assembly requests a lifting of martial law with the concurrent vote of a majority of total numbers of the National Assembly, which happened last night, the president shall comply. That's the language of the Constitution. So a president has no choice but to comply with the request with that kind of vote.
And now, in the aftermath of the declaration and the lifting of martial law, main opposition party lawmakers are planning to hold President Yoon accountable for treason. Can this be legally pursued, considering, the president has his privilege to be exempted from prosecution?
Yes, presidential immunity, yes, but it has exceptions, and exceptions are either insurrection or treason. In this case, because we're not talking about president working with the foreign powers, we're talking about insurrection. Anybody who creates a violence for purpose of excluding national power or the governance apparatus, he can be subject to insurrection charges. I think there are enough reasons, and especially his attempt to block legislatures and the legislative leaders from getting to the National Assembly to exercise their check and balance power. That gives them a reason to charge President Yoon Suk-yeol for insurrection. given the very short nature of the National Assembly, and he complied to the request to lift the martial law. I don't know it'll go through to the end and he's stripped of his presidential power or prosecuted. But I think that not charging him at this point would be a kind of dereliction of duty on the legislative side. So I think it'll go through and it will be instituted, and the president has to deal with the charges of insurrection.
Right, so we'll see how that moves forward. Now, hours ago, the South Korea's opposition party submitted motions to impeach President Yoon from his post. Professor Lee, could you remind us, what kind of legal procedures does it take to impeach an incumbent president? And do you think it's feasible under the current situation?
Right. So the Constitution provides for this process for impeachment. And so under the Constitution, the National Assembly can bring an impeachment motion against the president or any other high-ranking official for that matter, including the Minister of Defense, if the National Assembly believes that they violated the Constitution or any law in performance of their official duties. And so in this context, as you mentioned, there's been a filing already within the National Assembly to bring about such a motion. That motion will be debated and then eventually voted on. And if in fact is voted on, you get the 200 votes necessary, the minimum 200 votes necessary to pass the motion. Then it'll go on to then the Constitutional Court. And of course, we saw this with President Park Geun-hye when she was impeached, that this issue then went to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court will then have a trial. And ultimately, the Constitutional Court will then either bring about a conviction or an acquittal with respect to the impeachment process itself. And of course, if the Constitutional Court indeed then convicts, then in that context, then the president has to leave office. And it should be noted here too, once the Parliament or the National Assembly in this case brings about the motion and it passes and then goes to the Constitutional Court, the Prime Minister then sort of has to deal with the day-to-day operations of government because the president needs to step aside during the time of the trial. So of course, we're not at that point. A lot of things, of course, can happen in the meantime. But the big question here will be now, since the impeachment motion has been filed, the real question now immediately is, does the opposition have the votes, right? They have 192 seats, along with other kind of minor parties, progressive parties that have joined them. And so now the question is, will some members of the ruling party now sort of join forces with the opposition, in this case, to bring about a motion, then to bring about an impeachment. So I think these are the kinds of things that we'll be looking at very closely. And in fact, if the impeachment happens, as I think many people expect, now the question will be what happens at the trial in the Constitutional Court, and then how this plays out eventually to decide the future of the president.
Right, so the key for the first step is to pass 200 votes from the National Assembly, and we'll have to see if 8 more votes from the ruling bloc would give the green light. Now, lawmakers have claimed their swift actions to hold the president accountable are due to concerns over a possible re-imposition of martial law by Yoon. President Song, is this possible legally to reimpose martial law? And why is this a concern now that we know that the National Assembly has the power to overturn it?
Well, it is a presidential power. As long as he can exercise it legally, there is always a possibility to do it. But what happened yesterday should be a lesson for the president that imposing a martial law with the legislative power to overturn it would be pretty short exercise, if at that. But the real worry is that it's a short hop from a constitutionally permitted martial law to a completely paralyzing all checks and balances by swiftly putting lawmakers under custody, which was attempted in yesterday's botched martial law. So that would be not the imposition of martial law, but be a coup d'etat at that point. But I don't think Korea is at a stage where illegal martial law imposition by a renegade president will succeed or happen again. But this president has been under attack in many fronts. His wife has been under attack. He's been subjected to threats of the prosecutorial investigation from the parliament side. So there's no telling whether there would be another attempt for a Hail Mary to rescue the political situation by resorting to a kind of a nuclear option like the martial law. So that concern remains.
Right. And with this being said, Professor Lee, what are the potential legal implications of declaring martial law in a democratic system like South Korea? And how can legal safeguards prevent the abuse of such kind of extraordinary powers?
Right, as you described just with your question, it's an extraordinary act. I mean, it's the most dramatic act you can take within a democracy to, especially a democracy like Korea that has constitutional protections, to declare martial law and to suspend civil liberties. And so, as I was saying before, I mean, the implications of martial law are absolutely dramatic in the sense that, you know, in terms of constitutional authority, suspension of civil liberties, I mean, the imposition of military authority, right? And these are things that you hear about in other countries, not a mature democracy like Korea, where you have, you know, a stable democracy where people vote and you have a constitution that protects people's rights, human rights, and so this, in that context, I mean, the implications are huge. So, I mean, the real big thing I think for most people in this arena is to think about civil liberties in particular, because once the military takes control, right, you don't have the rights with respect to, you know, for example, if you're arrested, right, to appear before a civilian court, right, to get those protections that you can with respect to interrogations, right, having a lawyer present. I mean, all those things that we normally would expect in a mature democracy with constitutional protections would be all thrown out the window with respect to martial law. And then, of course, I mean, there's also the judicial oversight that I think is very important here, because as Professor Song was mentioning, I mean, checks and balances are essential in democracy and a constitutional order. And so if martial law is imposed, those checks and balances don't exist anymore. So, I mean, and there's good reason why it may not, because, of course, in a real emergency, you don't know who the enemy is. There may be sort of a real threat from within the country, and you got to arrest people quickly and expeditiously to get the threat away. But because we didn't have a situation like that, that's why so many people were outraged, naturally, because of the situation. So, and the second part of your question about legal safeguards, about sort of how we would then impose martial law, I mean, here in the Korean context, I think you saw it work really well, right? Because the National Assembly sort of is the check against the martial law being applied. And so in that context, unlike other countries which don't necessarily have the check with the legislative branch, then sort of being able to order the president to lift martial law, I mean, that legal safeguard, I think, is pretty unique to Korea, which you don't necessarily find in many other countries with respect to their martial law. So, I mean, in terms of legal safeguards, I think Korea probably has one of the most sophisticated martial law systems with respect to protecting democratic processes.
Right. Then are there particular features or flaws that make it more susceptible to misuse based on your understanding of international constitutional law?
Yeah, I mean, in other countries, if you sort of examine what other countries do, a lot of the sort of martial law, you know, orders or declarations are residing within the executive branch only, right? And they can be almost unilaterally made by the president or the prime minister, whoever's in charge. And so in that context, you know, Korea has a number of checks, I think, within the system. Again, this is the context of the state council, right? They need to deliberate. And the expectation is that someone would have said something, right, to the president, or there would have been a vote against it, right? And so the idea here is that there, even within the executive branch, there would have been some safeguards there applied to the situation. But more importantly, the fact that the legislative branch was also involved in the Constitution, I think, is one of the greatest safeguards you can have, right? I mean, you can certainly have the judicial branch involved, but the judicial branch takes too much time in terms of its decision making, right? But in the context of the Korean situation, with the National Assembly being authorized to be able to order the president that the president has to comply with the decision by the National Assembly to lift martial law. I think from that perspective, the safeguards did exist. And I think we saw that play out last night because martial law only lasted a few hours, as opposed to in other countries, it could last for months and years.
Right. And given this increased political instability and uncertainty in South Korea, what are the potential economic and security implications for Seoul following this martial law declaration, Professor Song?
Well, as Professor Lee mentioned, we saw that Korean constitutional system sort of works yesterday. It was a 2-hour antic from the imposition of the announcement of martial law to the passage of the request to lift the martial law from the National Assembly. That was about 2 hours. Having said that, though, there has to be some reforms within the political arrangements in Korea, because this kind of instability has been building up. I think that the president should be subjected to some kind of prosecutorial investigation for some of the charges that was brought against him. And the cabinet shakeup is another thing that I can think of. And also, judicial review should be instituted not only for the president, but those people who are involved in the due process of what the martial law should look like procedurally. And with that, I think we have to demonstrate to the world that there's a few hours, the antics of the misguided president did not and will not disturb the norms in political processes, policy makings, and economic and social normalcy in Korea. I think that the robustness of Korean democracy should be demonstrated and it should be shown. I think we could do that because I think we saw that the constitutional system works, and we have to kind of look at what needs to be adjusted here and there, I think mostly in the political systems.
Right, so we'll have to see how the situation settles down, but it seems to be critical to ensure that democratic principles and legal safeguards are upheld moving forward. Professor Song and Professor Lee, we'll have to leave our discussion here. Many thanks for your insights tonight.
My pleasure.
My pleasure.
You.
Now that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.